Devin Payton with the Office of Management and Budget. I appreciate your time this morning, and I hope to provide some good context for our discussion regarding property tax reform and, as Melissa said, the potential implications that it's going to have on Walton County. So to start, I wanted to kind of briefly outline what I'll cover in today's discussion. First, we're going to review House Joint Resolution 203, as Melissa has already stated, included the current legislative timeline and the potential implications of property tax reform for Walton County. And then I'm going to provide an overview of the county's current general fund revenue structure, and then I'm going to focus in on where those property taxes are currently allocated and for what services. And then third, I'll look at areas of the county budget that could be most affected if this proposal moves forward. And finally, we'll close by identifying some key considerations for the board, particularly as we continue to monitor the legislative process and evaluate potential impacts. That being said, the legislation currently under discussion for today is Joint Resolution 203. As Melissa stated, this proposal would eliminate non-school property taxes for homesteaded properties within the state. The bill was originally structured to phase in the property tax reductions over a 10-year period. However, that provision ultimately it got removed when the House passed it, so that phased approach is no longer in 203. Also, within 203, counties and cities will be required to fully fund public safety. So this would include law enforcement, fire, emergency medical services, and other similar emergency response functions. And the legislation specifies that these services must be funded at either the fiscal year 2026 level or 2027 level, whichever is higher. So as Melissa said, that measure is passed the House of Representatives. It's currently under Senate consideration, and this is kind of how our timeline would lay out. With regular session nearing its end, it's likely that the governor will call a special session to allow additional time for the Senate. And once a proposal is approved, it would be placed on a ballot in November for voter consideration. And because this is a constitutional amendment, it would require at least 60% approval from voters statewide to take effect. If approved, the reform would be effective January 1st of 2027, which would put us into the 2028 fiscal year budget cycle. So before we discuss the potential implications of this reform, I think it's helpful to review how property taxes currently work and what entities they are funded by. So I have a formula here at the top of the slide. So property taxes are calculated by taking a property's assessed value and then subtracting any current exemptions. So currently for a homesteaded property in the state, you receive $25,000 exemption that applies across the board to all taxes. And then in addition, a $25,000 exemption that applies only to non-school taxes. So after those exemptions are applied, the remaining taxable value is multiplied by the millage rate for that taxing authority. So that could be, the county, the municipality, a school district, a special taxing district. And then you divide that amount by 1,000 to determine the amount of taxes owed. One important key takeaway is that property taxes are not paid to a single entity or taxing authority. I think every budget cycle we have citizens engage with us that think that when they write a check out, it's to one entity, and most of the time it's at least to two, if not three or four. So instead, a property tax bill is divided, like I said, to several taxing authorities. And depending on where you live in Walton County, you could have municipal taxes for Defuniak, for Freeport. If you live in South Walton, you could have special district taxes for South Walton Mosquito Control, South Walton Fire District. So to give a simple example of how this works, if we look at a home in unincorporated North Walton County with an assessed value of $200,000 and with a current homestead exemption of $50,000, the homeowner would pay $528 for county government, $746 to the Walton County School District, and $66 to North Walton Mosquito Control. As Melissa said, essentially House Bill 203 is eliminating the county and North Walton Mosquito Control, which is roughly 42% of a homesteaded property tax bill. So it's not the complete elimination, it's the county government and the North Walton Mosquito Control portion. So that's what it looks like for an individual taxpayer, but what does it mean for Walton County? Well, if the proposed reform is implemented, the estimated impact on the county would be a reduction of $33 million in annual revenue. And again, that will begin in fiscal year 2028. So to put that number into a bit of context, 77% or $126 million of the current property tax revenue is already allocated towards state mandated or non-reducible expenses. And as Melissa stated at the beginning, I'm going to be referring throughout this presentation to state mandated expenses, and these are costs that the county is legally required to fund or services that cannot be reduced. Later on in the presentation, I'll walk through what those mandated expenses include and how they're distributed within the property tax revenue structure. So because such a large portion of our property tax revenue is already committed, the county has limited flexibility to absorb a reduction of this size. We simply can't just reduce in one area, but we're rather going to have to look at a possible reduction in multiple areas. So as a result, any significant revenue loss would primarily affect the portion of the budget that is for non-mandated services. This would include capital improvement projects, board-directed services, recreational programs, community programs, things of that nature. So this next slide here shows the composition of the general fund structure. As you'll see, property taxes are and will continue to be the largest source of revenue for the county. When you combine homestead and non-homesteaded property tax revenue, they account for approximately 83% of general fund revenue. Looking at the chart in more detail, non-homestead property taxes make up the largest share at about 66% or $132 million, with homestead property representing 16% or $33 million. The remaining portion of general fund revenue only accounts for 17% or roughly $35.8 million. Included in that additional revenue is the half-cent sales tax, which is about 9%, as well as charges for services at 3% and other revenue totaling 6%. I think the key point I want to mention here is that while the proposed legislation focused specifically on homestead property taxes, that portion still accounts for a significant share of the county's general fund revenue. So this next slide shows how that portion of property taxes paid for county government is currently allocated. The most important takeaway here is that a majority of property tax revenue, as I previously mentioned, is committed to state mandated services. So when we break that tax bill down, about 61% of property taxes paid to the county support the sheriff's office. Another 12% goes to constitutional officers. This includes the clerk of court, the property appraiser, the tax collector, the supervisor of election. And then in addition, about 4% support other mandated services, which I'll detail out in a later slide. So when you combine those categories, you get to that 77% of county property tax revenue that is already committed either to mandated services or to essential public safety functions that cannot be reduced. That leaves 23% of property tax revenue available for capital projects, general government services, and board-directed programs. So to put this in a little bit of perspective, in that previous slide, I said, you'd pay $528 for county government. If that dollar amount was sliced this way, $322 would go to support the sheriff's office and its functions, $63 would go to the constitutional officers, roughly $21 would fund that other mandated service category, and $122 would support the board initiatives and capital improvement projects. Again, I think this example helps illustrate the challenge that the county will face as the state looks to reduce property taxes. A large portion of our property tax revenue is already committed to state mandated or non-reducible services. So I've mentioned that I'll be kind of going down into a little more detail with these state mandated services. The first category I want to highlight is mandated public safety services. This represents the largest portion of the county's mandated expenses. Currently, for this budget year, the sheriff's office received $101 million in property tax support. And you'll recall, as I've mentioned at the beginning, that Proposal 203 allows for the higher budget of either fiscal year 26 or 27, so whichever is higher. Again, these funds support a wide range of sheriff's office functions that include law enforcement, jail, 911, animal control, fire rescue. In addition to the sheriff's office, the public safety category also includes funding for the medical examiner, so their operations and their facility, which this year totaled to $1.3 million. In addition to public safety, the county is also responsible for several costs associated with courts and justice system. These include funding for county and circuit court facilities, probation, the clerk of court, contributions towards the office of the public defender and state attorney. The county also participates in cost sharing with the state for juvenile detention and provides facilities and operational support for the guardian ad litem program. There's also a range of state-mandated health and human service programs that the county must fund. These include our share of the Medicaid contributions, indigent care programs, mental health and substance abuse services, child medical exams, and services related to unclaimed or indigent remains. In addition, the county provides funding to support the local health department. Beyond these categories, there are a number of other required costs that the county must fund. These include the budgets of the other remaining constitutional officers, the tax collector, the supervisor of election, the property appraisers, as well as the county's contribution to the Defuniac CRA. Additionally, planning and community development services and employee benefits, including participation in the Florida retirement system. So, as I've stated, because of mandated services and non-reducible expenses, the area that's left to absorb a budget reduction of this size is a relatively small portion of unmandated programs and services that remain. The largest of which, as you'll see, is capital improvement projects, which for the current fiscal year totaled $17.8 million. Along with this is funding for recreational services at $2.2 million. This is funding that supports the county libraries, maintenance at county parks, infrastructure for county parks, recreational programs such as youth basketball, youth soccer. Additionally, we have government services at $7.8 million. Included in this category is portions of funding for administration, legal, OMB, purchasing, human resources, engineering, environmental, et cetera, the other general fund government departments that provide either an internal service for the county or external services to the general public. Another category of non-mandated service includes landscape maintenance on Highway 98 and 331 for $1.2 million annually. And finally, we have board operating at 4.1, the health department funding at 1.7, and non-mandated programs at 3.3 million. And then I have a note there listing those out in detail. So if the county were required to absorb a $33 million revenue loss, the impact is likely not just to fall on one of these categories, but on multiple categories, and could result in the elimination or severe reduction of services and programs in the upcoming budget cycle. So looking ahead, there are several potential strategies that we'll consider as we monitor what's going on in the state. One option could be deferral or reprioritization of capital projects and major equipment purchases. For example, in fiscal year 2026, the general fund allocated $1.6 million for equipment and vehicle purchases. We may have to defer those in future budget cycles if there's not revenue to support that. And as previously mentioned, the $17.8 million for capital improvement projects. Another possible strategy could involve adjusting service levels or reevaluating certain programs altogether. This could include reducing or reevaluating non-mandated programs and services. Examples could include, as I've mentioned, recreational programs, library services, operating hours, reduction of library facilities, park maintenance, park improvement projects, right-of-way beautification initiatives, funding partnerships, cultural and community events supported by the county, economic development initiatives, environmental programs. The list could go on and on. Alternatively, the board may also wish to look at revenue options for services that the public deems are necessary and that they don't wish to lose and would rather pay than to see kind of cut off. So as we continue to monitor, as I said, we'll continue to ask these questions as we go throughout the budget process and get closer and closer to a final proposal that will ultimately be on a ballot. We'll continue to review what service levels can realistically be sustained if the county experiences a reduction. We'll need to consider what capital projects should move forward, which ones might need to be deferred or scaled back. We'll need to assess how the county will continue to meet all the listed state mandated services if financial flexibility becomes more limited. If we have an increase in one of those previously mentioned service areas, what will we have to reduce on the other side to balance the budget? And then finally, we may need to evaluate potential revenue sources for services or programs that the public does not wish to lose. So in closing, while the property tax reform is still under consideration, I think what my biggest thing I want to impress on is that it is likely to have a huge impact to Walton County and the services that the county provides. I put together a short 3-minute survey that I hope the public will use to gather community input regarding services and their views of property tax reform. And I appreciate your time this morning.